Ghislain didn't know he had a fiancée. Belinda and Elena teased him, saying he shouldn't play dumb just because he was embarrassed. Elena mentioned that Ghislain's fiancée was Amelia from the Rayfold country. Ghislain's eyes widened in shock as he remembered who Amelia Rayfold was. The Spider-Woman, Amelia, a noble among nobles, known for her kindness and generosity toward everyone regardless of status, had earned the deep support of her people. However, she would later incite rebellion and come to be known as the Witch of the North. Amelia was also the traitor who joined hands with the Delphine Duchy to drive the final nail into Perdium's downfall. A traitor? Ghislain smiled and asked Belinda when his father would be returning. Belinda replied that his father would be back in a week. Ghislain grew serious, thinking that 1 week should be enough for his plan. He walked out of the room and informed Belinda that he would be visiting Rayfold country. Belinda tried to stop him, saying, "It's not Amelia's birthday yet, so why are you going there?" Ghislain looked at Belinda and simply stated, "I'll get my money from Amelia." Somewhere in Rayfold County, a young girl with a spider resting on her lips placed her shoes on the ground. She turned to a poor, ragged girl and ordered her to wear the expensive-looking shoes in front of a crowd. The young girl, dirty and dressed in torn gray clothing, clutched at her rags while calling out in a trembling voice, "Lady Amelia." Amelia looked at the girl and declared, "If anyone has to walk barefoot on my land, it should be me." She ordered her guards to provide shelter and food for the poor citizens of Rayfold. Without hesitation, the guards distributed supplies. The people thanked Amelia as she walked away, barefoot, with her escort. At the Rayfold County estate, Amelia's garden, Amelia's escort knight, Bernaf, carefully washed her feet. As Amelia petted her white, fluffy cat, she mused, "The common folk will follow the one who keeps them warm and well-fed." Bernaf responded, "You have won their hearts, my lady." Silence. Amelia turned to Bernaf, then suddenly kicked him in the face. "What happened to your duel against the finest sword of the north?" she asked coldly. Bernaf lowered his gaze. "I lost." To avoid Amelia's piercing glare, he added, "It's not yet time to show your claws." Bernaf knelt, grasped Amelia's foot, and kissed it in submission. Amelia cupped his chin, looking him in the eyes, and whispered, "You are not allowed to be weak." She then changed the topic. "What about the merchant?" Bernaf reassured her. "All materials for the reconstruction of the Beast Forest outpost, recently half destroyed by orc attacks in Perdium, are being purchased through our merchant guild." He also reported that they were recruiting all the soldiers and knights leaving Perdium, many of whom were well-trained from battles against barbarian tribes. Amelia smirked. "Make sure no one learns their true identity until we build up our strength." Just then, a butler interrupted their discussion. "Lady Amelia, Ghislain has come to visit." Amelia, confused, asked, "Why would a punk like Ghislain come here?" The butler explained, "He wishes to discuss the merchant guild." Both Amelia and Bernaf was surprised. At the visitor's room, Amelia sat across from Ghislain, stroking her cat. Ghislain, sitting casually, greeted her. Amelia's cat hissed at him as Amelia stared him down. "It's quite unpleasant for you to visit unannounced, Ghislain." "How mannerless." Ghislain chuckled. "Since your birthday is coming soon, I thought I'd give you your gift in advance." He placed a flower, one he had picked up from the merchant guild, and put it on the table. "The fragrance is quite nice. I think I'll start buying flowers from there from now on." Ghislain sipped his tea and casually mentioned, "I believe the name of the merchant was Arctium." Amelia silently processed his words. How does Ghislain know about the merchant guild I'm using as a cover? Feigning ignorance, she stood up. "Well, I've received my gift. Now leave." Her cat hissed again. As she turned to go, Ghislain's voice rang out in a commanding tone. "Sit down." A chill ran down Amelia's spine. She turned to Ghislain in shock, feeling an oppressive pressure coming from him. "This isn't the same weak boy who used to squirm and barely speak in front of me." Ghislain swirled his tea and said calmly, "I need my money. Give me 10,000 gold." Amelia's expression froze. "What? You heard me." Amelia seethed with rage. "You barge into my home, demand a ridiculous sum of money, and think I'll just hand it over?" Her cat continued to hiss. Ghislain dumped his tea onto the floor and locked eyes with Amelia. "You have no intention of marrying me anyway." Amelia shot him a furious glare. Ghislain leaned back. "If word gets out that you're secretly building up power in Rayfold, where the fight for succession is fierce, it would be problematic for you." Amelia's cat hissed again. "This cat think it's a lion." Amelia narrowed her eyes. "You shouldn't say things like that, not even as a joke." Ghislain smirked. "Don't worry. As long as you give me what I want, I'll keep your secret." Amelia's patience snapped. "That won't happen." She called her escort knight. "Bernaf." The door creaked open, and Bernaf strides in with an extra bounce in his step, acting like he's the star of some epic tale. "Ghislain," Bernaf greeted, his voice deep and composed. Ghislain sized him up. "Bernaf, a skilled warrior, one with the potential to rival the finest sword of the north." Ghislain smirked. "Are you really going to eliminate me? That would likely start a war. Are you sure you can handle the consequences?" Amelia scoffed. "Who said anything about war? If we eliminate you, we'll simply claim that a ruffian barged in, caused chaos, and was taken down by my knights. No one would question it." She touched the spider on her lips and commanded, "Bernaf, eliminate him." With a swift motion, Bernaf drew his sword. Ghislain remained seated, gripping his sheathed sword, a confident smirk on his face. He had been expecting this all along. Ghislain was ready for Bernaf. He suddenly felt something on his back. One of the armor displays had moved. An assassin stabbed him from behind. Reacting instantly, Ghislain rolled forward and kicked the assassin through the window. Bernaf and Amelia were shocked. Ghislain turned to Amelia, eyes sharp. An assassin? Really? Does Rayfold not know of chivalry? Without hesitation, Ghislain raised his sword and attacked Bernaf. Bernaf blocked the strike and grabbed Ghislain's sword. He counterattacked, but Ghislain managed to dodge. Flipping over Bernaf's back, Ghislain landed behind him and kicked him away. Bernaf was stunned. He had no idea Ghislain possessed such skill. Ghislain stood firm, a blue aura emanating from him. Amelia, watching the fight, scoffed at Bernaf, questioning how he could be struggling against a punk like Ghislain. Frustrated, she ordered Bernaf to bring her Ghislain's head. Bernaf's expression turned serious. He pointed his sword at Ghislain. Bernaf thrust forward with incredible speed, his attack barely grazing Ghislain's face. Their fight intensified, both displaying exceptional skill. Amelia watched in disbelief. How in the hell is this so-called lousy punk fighting Bernaf on equal footing? Bernaf thrust his sword, but Ghislain blocked it. Using the hilt, Ghislain hooked Bernaf's blade and attempted a counterattack, but Bernaf grabbed Ghislain's sword with his arm. Bernaf struck back. Ghislain tried the same tactic again, but this time Bernaf was prepared. He threw Ghislain to the ground. Without missing a beat, Bernaf followed up with another attack while Ghislain was still down. Ghislain blocked it with his foot, flipping into the air to create distance. But in doing so, he lost his sword. Ghislain quickly realized that Bernaf was using mana to endure the fight. Ghislain knew that fighting Bernaf at his current level would be difficult. But he had a trick up his sleeve. Unseen by Bernaf, Ghislain had attached a mana thread to his sword. With a swift tug, he pulled it back, striking Bernaf hard on the back of his head. Taking advantage of the opening, Ghislain stepped onto Bernaf's knee and drove his own knee into Bernaf's face. Amelia's jaw dropped in shock. But Ghislain wasn't finished yet. He pressed forward with another attack, but Bernaf managed to parry and push him back. Realizing the intensity of the fight, Bernaf turned to Amelia. He urged her to leave the room, warning that he could no longer guarantee her safety. This time, he would fight Ghislain seriously. Ghislain grinned. Amelia, clutching her cat, ran away from Bernaf and Ghislain, her mind racing. Who could have leaked the information about the merchant guild to Ghislain? As she turned a corner, she froze. A mysterious hooded figure stood before her, surrounded by the lifeless bodies of her guards. The hooded figure slowly turned to face Amelia. It was Belinda. Amelia couldn't believe her eyes. Before she could react, Belinda suddenly appeared behind her, pressing a knife to her throat. "Be quiet," Belinda whispered coldly. With a swift motion, Belinda removed the spider from Amelia's lips. She remembered something. During the engagement ceremony, she had overheard a conversation between her lord and Count Rayfold. Amelia's own siblings had mocked her for keeping creepy spiders around her. So, in retaliation, Amelia had raised the spiders herself and taken her revenge. Belinda glanced down at the spider in her hand, then dropped it to the floor, crushing it under her boot. Meanwhile, Bernaf and Ghislain continued their fierce battle. Ghislain eyed Bernaf as overwhelming mana surging around him. Bernaf lunged forward with an attack. Ghislain blocked it. But Bernaf didn't stop. He followed up with a flurry of rapid thrusts, each strike faster than the last. Ghislain struggled, barely managing to block and dodge the relentless assault. Enough! Ghislain intercepted Bernaf's next attack and immediately countered. But Bernaf parried it with ease. In a blink, Bernaf countered with a thrust, and it landed. Blood gushed. Bernaf was stunned. Ghislain had blocked his attack with his shoulder. Without hesitation, Ghislain struck back. Bernaf deflected the blow and kicked Ghislain hard, sending him crashing into the wall. Bernaf wasted no time. He charged forward for a finishing attack. But Ghislain was ready. In a split second, he composed himself and unleashed his third mana core. With explosive speed, Ghislain dashed toward Bernaf. He deflected Bernaf's thrust, used his sword guard to hook Bernaf's blade, twisted it, and, using the momentum, disarmed him completely. Bernaf was speechless. Ghislain raised his sword for the final blow, aiming straight for Bernaf's head. "Stop!" A voice rang through the air. Irritated, Amelia stood there, glaring. "Take the 10,000 gold and leave," she spat. Ghislain glanced at her, then smirked. "You should have handed it over when I was asking nicely." He lifted his sword and took a step toward her. "Unfortunately," Ghislain said, his voice cold, "the fee just went up." He grinned. 20,000 gold. Amelia threw a vase to the floor in frustration. Bernaf apologized, admitting that he hadn't known Ghislain could wield mana surpassing that of an advanced-level knight. Amelia, looking dead inside, couldn't believe how much Ghislain had changed. Bernaf then suggested reporting the incident to the Delphine Duchy. Without warning, Amelia struck Bernaf across the face. She snapped that if Duke Delphine discovered what had happened that day, they would be ruined. Angry and frustrated, she vowed to do whatever it took to neutralize Ghislain. She then demanded an update on Ghislain's condition after the fight. Bernaf explained that he had managed to inflict light injuries and that, since Ghislain had burned through an explosive amount of mana, he would not be in peak condition for some time. He also pointed out that if they truly wanted to eliminate Ghislain, they could not use their knights, as leaving no traces was crucial. Amelia's eyes darkened as she uttered a single name, the Wildcats. The Wildcats were a group of war orphans, those without kin or status. Only the most talented natural-born specialists were among them, assassins, thieves, and traffickers. Without hesitation, she ordered Bernaf to send a dozen of them to ambush Ghislain. A twisted grin spread across her face as she declared that Ghislain would pay for the humiliation he had inflicted upon her. Inside a moving carriage, Ghislain tended to his wounds. Considering he had fought Bernaf, his injuries were not as severe as they could have been. His gaze shifted to the chest tucked in the back of the carriage. 20,000 gold, the amount he had taken from Amelia. It was enough to cover the base funds needed to rebuild his territory. Of course, eliminating Amelia as well would have been ideal, but doing so would have started a war. With a smirk tugging at his lips, he fastened his coat, already thinking of how best to use Amelia to his advantage this time. Belinda, watching him closely, asked if things were unfolding exactly as he had planned. As they spoke, Ghislain suddenly winced in pain. Belinda and Fergus tensed, immediately asking if he was all right. A cough, then another. Blood splattered onto the carriage floor. The recoil from opening his third mana core was taking its toll. He knew he needed to increase his mana, and fast. Belinda grabbed his wrist, checking his pulse. Then, without hesitation, she pulled out a large needle, muttering that the flow of his mana was in complete disarray. She began acupuncture on his hand, and almost immediately, Ghislain felt something shift within him. His body reacted, and moments later, he expelled mana from his system with a loud burp. Realization struck him. His mana road had opened slightly after the acupuncture. His gaze snapped to Belinda, serious and searching. He had always known she was no ordinary maid. After all, his mother had brought her into his life. But the question remained, who exactly was she? Regardless, he reasoned that it was always beneficial to have skilled individuals on his side. After all, the enemies he had faced so far were only the beginning. Belinda met his gaze and assured him that she would help him, stating that she trusted him unconditionally. However, she then pressed him for an answer. Why had he taken such a huge amount of money from Amelia? Ghislain's response was blunt. He simply stated that he needed to spend money, and Amelia was the only wealthy person he knew. Both Belinda and Fergus froze at his words. Belinda's expression twitched with disbelief before she furiously demanded if that had been the reason he had broken the engagement. She warned that if Count Rayfold discovered the truth, Ghislain would be in serious trouble. Unfazed, Ghislain reassured her that Amelia would not tell her father. Then, with an unwavering gaze, he asked if Belinda trusted him. After a brief moment of hesitation, she admitted that she had no choice but to do so. Sighing, she then questioned what he planned to do with the money. Ghislain's smirk widened slightly as he uttered his answer, the Forest of Beasts. Belinda's eyes widened in shock. He reaffirmed his intent to pioneer the Forest of Beasts. Fergus immediately protested, reminding him that attempts at developing the forest had been made since his great-grandfather's time, all of which had ended in failure. Ignoring the protest, Ghislain turned to Fergus and asked if he remembered the request Ghislain had made before they entered the castle. Fergus confirmed that the person Ghislain had been searching for was indeed at the location he had mentioned. Ghislain decided that they would head there immediately. Belinda, however, argued that they needed to return home first due to his condition. Ghislain met her eyes, his gaze cold and unwavering. He questioned whether she truly believed that Amelia would allow them to leave unscathed after what they had done. Belinda smirked, assuring him that she and Fergus were more than capable of handling Amelia's minions. Ghislain chuckled at her confidence but declined her offer, stating that what he truly needed was a vanguard. Their journey led them to a shabby house deep within the forest. Ricardo knocked twice on the wooden door. A creak. Slowly, the door opened. An old man with a thick, unkempt beard stepped out, his sharp eyes scrutinizing them. With a gruff voice, he demanded to know what they wanted. Everyone except Ghislain tensed. Belinda leaned in, whispering her doubts, questioning if Ghislain was certain this was the man they were looking for. The old man scoffed, dismissing them. He accused the young noble of seeking entertainment and told them not to waste his time before ordering them to leave. He turned to shut the door. But then Ghislain spoke. He addressed the man by name, Gillian. Then, without hesitation, he identified him as the ex-captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. The old man stiffened, his eyes widening in recognition. Ghislain met his gaze, unwavering. He told Gillian that he had been looking for him. Both Ricardo and Fergus were stunned upon hearing the name Ratatosk mercenaries. The Ratatosk mercenaries was a group that only those who had mastered most weapons could join. Although they no longer existed, their bravery was such that any knight, even from foreign lands, was bound to hear their name at least once. And the captain of that mercenary group was Gillian. An axe flew toward Ghislain, passing just beside his head, almost hitting him. Fergus, Ricardo, and Belinda were shocked. They all drew their weapons, except for Ghislain. Gillian, looking both angry and serious, demanded to know Ghislain's business. With his knife drawn, Belinda urged Ghislain to step back. But Ghislain simply uttered two words: the eternal punishment. Gillian's eyes widened in shock. Ghislain then explained that he knew the cure to the incurable illness Gillian's daughter was suffering from. The eternal punishment was a disease with symptoms of high fever, coughing up blood, and red spots blooming like flower petals on the skin. The sight of a patient writhing in pain, resembling a prisoner under punishment, had given this incurable disease its name, the eternal punishment. A pained cry rang from inside the house, Gillian's daughter. Without hesitation, Gillian and the others rushed inside. Gillian knelt beside his daughter, Rachel, holding her in his arms as if his embrace could ease her suffering. Ghislain observed Rachel's condition, concluding that there was still time to save her. In his past life, he had searched for Gillian to recruit him, but he had been too late. Gillian had lost everything and ended his own life after Rachel had passed away. Ghislain glanced around the house. Judging from its poor condition, it was clear that Gillian had spent all his assets trying to treat his daughter. Rachel continued to cry out for her father, her voice filled with agony. The sight of her suffering was unbearable. There was no time to waste. Ghislain removed his coat, preparing to begin Rachel's treatment. But before he could start, Belinda suddenly stopped him. She insisted that they should leave, pointing out that even priests had failed to cure the disease, calling it divine punishment. Ghislain, unfazed, stated firmly that he could fix her. Looking straight at Belinda, he reminded her of her own words. She had said she trusted him. Belinda fell silent, unable to argue further. Ghislain then handed her a list of medicinal herbs needed to cure Rachel. As she scanned the list, her eyes widened in shock. Meanwhile, Ghislain opened a pouch and began preparing the medicine. Fortunately, he still remembered the formula clearly. The only problem was the cost. These ingredients were expensive. He grabbed a purple flower called Fairy's Blessing and started chopping it. Then, he packed the herbs into a bottle, poured in distilled alcohol, shook the mixture, and let it sit for a while. Afterward, he added the remaining ingredients and stirred. Once the medicine was ready, Ghislain handed the vial to Gillian, instructing him to have Rachel drink it. Gillian administered the medicine to his daughter. Slowly, the redness began to fade from Rachel's face. Everyone was speechless. Belinda and Fergus could hardly believe their eyes. Gillian, even more stunned, watched in disbelief as the medicine took effect. Struggling to comprehend, Gillian turned to Ghislain and asked how he had known the cure, when not even divine power had been able to heal Rachel. Ghislain explained that divine power was not omnipotent. While it enhanced the body's vitality and strengthened a person's regenerative abilities, it was not the same as a fundamental cure. Gillian's hands trembled as he gripped Ghislain. Desperation in his voice, he asked if Ghislain could truly cure Rachel. With unwavering confidence, Ghislain assured him that in a few months, Rachel would be completely healed. Gillian looked at him for a long moment, then bowed deeply. He offered himself in servitude, saying he had nothing left to give, not even his own freedom. Ghislain, however, rejected the offer. He did not need a slave. He needed the captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. Gillian met Ghislain's gaze and, for the first time, saw something unusual in his eyes, the eyes of a dreamer. Without hesitation, Gillian grabbed his long, braided hair and sliced through it with his axe. Everyone was shocked. Everyone except Ghislain. Now with shorter hair, Gillian's entire presence seemed to transform. Then, as if sensing something, he turned to Ghislain and asked if there was anyone else with them besides the four of them. Ghislain confirmed that it was only them. Gillian's expression darkened. Grabbing a harpoon, he asked if Ghislain had any enemies who might be after him. Ghislain calmly replied that he did, and there would be more in the future. Without another word, Gillian switched his grip on the harpoon and hurled it through the wall of his house. A moment later, he yanked it back, dragging a hooded figure into the room. The intruder, clad in dark clothes, was unmistakably a member of the Wildcats, one of the assassins Amelia had sent. Gillian turned to Ghislain and asked what he wanted to do with the captive. Ghislain, already aware of who had sent the man, reached for his sword. But he hesitated. This was his first meeting with Gillian, and he had no desire to stain his blade just yet. Before he could act, Gillian stopped him. "Leave it to me," he said. Then, without hesitation, Gillian crushed the man's throat with his bare hands. Belinda watched the scene unfold. There was not a hint of hesitation in Gillian's movements. She found herself wondering, why would Ghislain recruit such a dangerous man? Gillian knelt before Ghislain. With solemn resolve, he declared that his life now belonged to Ghislain. With this, Ghislain had secured a crucial piece for his upcoming reconstruction plan. Inside a shack, a group of Wildcats was discussing the reconnaissance unit's failure. The captain of the Wildcats, Vigo, sat among them and ordered them to be quiet. Vigo questioned how the reconnaissance team could have failed when Ghislain was currently weak. One of the members hesitantly reported that it seemed Gillian had joined Ghislain's group. Vigo's eyes widened in surprise. In an instant, he grabbed the man by the throat, demanding to know if he was sure. Struggling to breathe, the man gasped that he had seen it with his own eyes. Vigo's expression turned serious. Gillian was not just anyone, he was Vigo's former captain. Meanwhile, Gillian drove the carriage. Inside, Belinda was complaining about how cramped it was due to the large number of weapons piled up. Frustrated, she said they needed to buy another carriage just for the weapon. Ghislain explained that they would have had to purchase a new one anyway to transport Rachel comfortably. Besides, he added, Gillian had a use for all the weapons, so he asked Belinda to bear with it for now. Belinda then shifted the conversation to the watcher they had captured, stating with certainty that he had been sent by Lady Amelia. She also recognized the symbol the man wore, one associated with the Wildcats' traffickers. She elaborated that the Wildcats specialized in smuggling, assassination, drug and human trafficking, and various other crimes. Many of them, she noted, were skilled former mercenaries. Curious, Ghislaine asked how she knew so much, considering she had spent most of her time in the castle. Belinda attempted to dodge the question, vaguely saying that she had simply heard many things before starting work at Perdium State. Then she warned Ghislaine to be careful. Ghislaine, however, dismissed her concern, assuring her that everything would be fine. Belinda fell silent, glancing at Ghislaine. Night fell, but their journey continued. Suddenly, something appeared beside the carriage. Gillian noticed it immediately, then 2 members of the Wildcats emerged from the ground. It was an ambush from below. Without hesitation, Gillian grabbed his sword and axe from his back. As the 2 attackers lunged at him, Gillian blocked their strikes and counterattacked. The carriage never even slowed. He fought as if nothing had happened. Then, another Wildcat cut a rope, sending a massive tree crashing onto the road in front of them. Ghislaine had expected an ambush at some point. In an instant, the carriage was surrounded by Wildcats. Vigo stepped forward, calling out to Gillian, the former captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. With a sneer, Vigo mocked Gillian, calling him a coward for disbanding the entire mercenary group because of his daughter. Gillian stepped down from the carriage, his expression unreadable. He denied knowing what Vigo was talking about. But Vigo was unconvinced. He blamed Gillian for the miserable life he now led, accusing him of abandoning his comrades. His voice seething with anger, he demanded to know if Gillian had truly forgotten his former peers. Then, without hesitation, Vigo ordered his men to eliminate Gillian and the others. Ghislaine offered to assist, but Gillian declined. It was clear that Vigo had personal business with him. Gillian charged his axe with mana. Then, in a single swing, he cut 4 Wildcats in half. 2 more rushed at him. Gillian swiftly struck down one of the attackers and blocked the second, slicing through the man's arm with ease. Seeing their comrades fall, the others attempted to surround Gillian. But Gillian leaped onto a horse from the carriage, grabbed his poleaxe, and rode straight toward the enemy. Spinning his weapon as he charged, he unleashed a devastating attack. His mana-infused poleaxe severed an opponent's arm in an instant. Then, gripping the rope attached to his weapon, Gillian swung it in a wide arc, cutting multiple enemies in half. Above him, Vigo seized an opening and launched an aerial attack. Gillian reacted swiftly, raising his shield just in time to block the strike. Vigo, undeterred, grabbed a throwing knife and hurled it toward Gillian's horse, striking it in the neck. As the horse collapsed, Gillian leaped off. Vigo wasted no time, immediately closing the distance. Gillian met his attack head-on, blocking with his axe before slamming his shield into Vigo, knocking him backward. Gillian fixed Vigo with a steady gaze. He declared that he was no longer the captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. Now, he was nothing but Lord Ghislaine's subordinate. Gillian charged his axe with mana once more. Vigo's face twisted in fury. With a roar, he lunged at Gillian. Vigo launched a relentless barrage of attacks, but Gillian blocked them with his shield. One of Vigo's knife strikes, however, pierced through the shield. Without hesitation, Gillian yanked his shield back to dislodge the knife before launching a counterattack at Vigo. Vigo swiftly dodged and retaliated with a powerful kick, shattering Gillian's shield. Both fighters paused. Vigo, his voice filled with resentment, declared that he had been willing to sacrifice his life to make the Ratatosk mercenaries the greatest in history, only for Gillian to throw it all away, just to become a servant of a spoiled noble. Furious, Vigo stated that he could never forgive Gillian for this. With that, he imbued 3 throwing knives with mana and hurled them at Gillian. Gillian deflected them to the ground with his axe. Vigo seized the opportunity, leaping toward Gillian and striking. His attack missed, but he quickly spun mid-air and attempted another strike, only to be blocked again. Frustration grew in Vigo's eyes. He believed that no matter how strong Gillian was, his peak had been years ago, back when he was still the captain of the mercenaries. The battle continued. Vigo dodged Gillian's attacks with agility, leaping and landing on Gillian's back, right where the 3 daggers he had thrown earlier lay embedded. With a swift motion, Vigo kicked the daggers toward Gillian. Gillian, however, blocked it using his shoulder guard. Wasting no time, Vigo lunged at him. Gillian swung his weapon to counter, but Vigo dodged by jumping, following up with another attack. Gillian, his hand now glowing with mana, caught the dagger mid-air. Vigo's eyes widened in shock. Then, in a brutal strike, Gillian slammed his axe into Vigo's face, sending him crashing into a tree. Vigo dropped to his knees, battered and bloodied. Gillian slowly walked toward him, confusion evident in his expression. He questioned why Vigo had sought revenge now, when he had already had countless opportunities before. Vigo, blood dripping down his face, admitted that he had already visited Gillian at his home. But when he arrived, there had been no captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries waiting for him. Only a feeble old man, unworthy of even being killed. Voice trembling with rage, Vigo demanded to know what had happened to the Gillian he once admired. Gillian tossed Vigo's weapon onto the ground, telling him to pick it up. Then, drawing the sword from his back, Gillian stated that he, too, was a body bound to another's will. But at least, in this moment, he would show his former comrade the highest level of respect, as the captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. Vigo grabbed his knife and charged at Gillian. A manic grin spread across his face as he shouted in joy. This was exactly what he had wished for. Their battle resumed. Vigo dodged Gillian's attacks, countering with a swift kick before following up with a thrust. Gillian parried the strike and retaliated, his blade sinking into Vigo's side. Vigo gritted his teeth through the pain and swung his dagger in response, but his attack missed. Gillian raised his axe. He declared that he would remember Vigo, the 5th unit commander of the Ratatosk mercenaries, Vigo Villanos. In that moment, Vigo realized the truth. He had been fighting not just Gillian, but Gillian, the captain of the Ratatosk mercenaries. Beside Vigo's lifeless body, his dagger lay still. Gillian picked it up and looked at him in silence. A voice interrupted. Ghislain spoke, praising his efforts. Gillian turned to see both Ghislain and Belinda standing nearby. Belinda, ever practical, commented that selling the Wildcat's loot could bring in quite a bit of money. She turned to Ghislain for confirmation. Gillian apologized for causing unnecessary delays. Ghislain reassured him that it was fine. As he looked at Gillian, he realized something. Gillian was far more exceptional than he had expected. Memories surfaced. When Ghislain had first left home to begin his mercenary work, stories of Gillian, passed down by his seniors, had helped shape him into the mercenary king. Moving quickly had been the right decision. Thanks to that, he had gained a reliable comrade. Ghislain asked if Gillian remembered who Vigo was. Gillian, still holding Vigo's dagger, looked up. He acknowledged that Vigo had once been his comrade. Ghislain wondered aloud what had become of his own former comrades, deciding that one day, he would seek them out. For now, he turned to the present. He asked if they should take Belinda's suggestion and gather the loot. Belinda promptly ordered Gillian to take the lead in collecting it. Gillian, unimpressed, countered that he wasn't Belinda's subordinate. 2 days later, at Perdium territory, Ghislain and his group caught sight of Perdium Castle in the distance. A sense of familiarity washed over him. It felt good to have a home to return to. When he had first run away, he had believed he could return at any time. Ghislain turned to Gillian, asking how he liked their land. Gillian, startled, hesitated before responding that it was great. Ghislain smirked. He bluntly stated that it was awful. Then he elaborated. The houses were outdated and renovations were out of the question. The fields lay barren, abandoned by the farmers who had once worked them. Gillian had always heard that Perdium was constantly at war with the northern barbarians. But seeing it firsthand, he realized that the situation was far worse than he had expected. Belinda, too, was stunned. She had never thought Ghislain knew the land situation so well. As the group stood, looking over Perdium, Ghislain made a declaration. He vowed to resolve every problem plaguing the land. That was why he needed their strength. It would be a long battle, a battle to eliminate everything tied to Duke Delphine, and to protect what had once been taken for granted. But no matter what, he swore to revive Perdium. As the carriage entered the town, Belinda called for Ghislain's attention. He followed her gaze, and his body tensed. At the entrance to the town, clad in armor and atop a horse, his father was waiting. Inside Perdium Castle, Ghislain, his father, and the others discussed whether they needed to reduce their forces. However, if they did, they would have difficulty maintaining the front line. Another person suggested requesting more support from Rayfold, but Rayfold had already reduced the support funds. It appeared that Rayfold was gathering its soldiers and stockpiling food as well. The discussion continued about rebuilding the garrison in the Forest of the Beast, which had been partially destroyed in the battle with the orcs. As the conversation went on, Ghislain smiled, thinking that nothing had changed. He wondered how long it had been since he had become the young lord of Perdium. Had it only been a few months? But as the mercenary king, it had been several decades. Ghislain greeted his father, Count Walter Perdium. He had never liked his father for being strict and serious all the time, but now he understood why. The countless burdens, exhaustion, and fatigue weighed on his father's shoulders. The responsibility of being the lord of their land. His father sipped his tea and mentioned that Ghislain had been away from the castle for about a week. Ghislain responded that he had visited the Rayfolds. As Ghislain sipped his tea, his father inquired whether he had caused any trouble there. Ghislain assured him that he had not. Albert, the treasurer of Perdium, then asked if it was true that Ghislain had won against Cain and made some money. He also expressed hope that Ghislain hadn't gone to Rayfold just to gamble. But Ghislain was not gambling. If anything, he was investing. He clarified that he had not gambled, and that he had some business with Amelia. His father then mentioned hearing that Ghislain had executed Jamal and Philip, who had tried to sell Elena away, and asked if it was true. Randolph, the Perdium knight captain, didn't believe that Ghislain had executed Philip and Jamal by himself. He speculated that the two had fought against each other, and Ghislain had merely delivered the final blow while exaggerating the story. Ghislain thought that Randolph simply didn't want to accept that his knight had been eliminated by the weak young lord of Perdium. To avoid trouble, Ghislain simply agreed with Randolph's version of events. To his surprise, his father commended him, saying that regardless of the process, what mattered was that Elena was alive. Ghislain was silent for a moment. This was the first compliment he had ever received from his father. He then asked if he could request something. The others immediately countered, assuming he was about to ask for money as a reward. Randolph grew angry, recalling how Ghislain had previously sold military provisions to fund his gambling, set the front gate on fire to grill an army horse, and melted all the armor to forge some legendary sword, or something. It seemed like Ghislain had done a lot. Ignoring the accusations, Ghislain continued with his request. His father asked what it was for. Ghislain declared that he wanted permission to pioneer the forest of the beast. The entire room fell silent in shock. His father immediately refused. As Ghislain explained the situation to Belinda and Gillian, he mentioned that his father had freaked out and started shouting at him. Belinda was unsurprised, pointing out that the forest was filled with monsters and had nothing to gain. Ghislain then asked Gillian for his opinion. Gillian stated that the place was commonly referred to as the Forest of Death, a place from which no one returned alive. Because of this, very little was known about it, and everyone avoided it. Its notoriety had even spread to other regions. As Ghislain and Gillian started walking out of the room, ready to begin their expedition, Belinda shouted at Ghislain, reminding him that he hadn't received permission. Yet, he still intended to proceed. Ghislain turned back and told her that he didn't need his father's permission. It was merely a courtesy. This had to be done regardless. Belinda sighed, exasperated. She wondered what could possibly be in that forest to make Ghislain so obsessed with it. Ghislain promised he would tell her later. However, he knew that if he revealed it now, word would spread, causing unnecessary trouble. If he successfully pioneered the forest, he would be able to earn an enormous amount of funds. Deep inside the forest was a massive runestone vein, buried beneath the surface. Runestone was an ore infused with mana, an extremely rare mineral that mages were absolutely crazy about. It was used in magical tools, barriers, magic circles, scrolls, alchemy, essentially anything related to magic and mana. In Ghislain's previous life, Duke Delphine had been the one to discover it. But this time, only Ghislain had this knowledge. Belinda, though upset, had no choice but to follow Ghislain. Ghislain instructed Belinda to head to the nearby guild and hire about 200 mercenaries. She expressed concern, believing he was spending too much of the money he had risked his life to obtain. Gillian was also concerned, noting that mercenaries were an unruly bunch, difficult to control, and prone to turning on their employer to take everything for themselves. Ghislain agreed. That was precisely why he and Gillian would personally pick out the useful ones. Gillian's expression turned serious as he asked if Ghislain was planning to hire the crazy dogs. Mercenaries skilled in battle but infamous for betraying their employers if things went south. These were the Cerberus mercenaries. Without hesitation, Ghislain and Gillian set off for the Cerberus camp to put a leash on those wild dogs. At the outskirts of Zimbar territory, the Cerberus mercenaries' camp loomed ahead. A scout spotted Ghislain and Gillian approaching. Judging by Ghislain's noble appearance, the scout smirked, thinking they could make a lot of money off him. However, before he could react, a hand appeared inside his scope, gripping his head. The other mercenaries were stunned as they saw Gillian crushing their comrade's skull. Without a word, Gillian threw the man aside. Fury erupted among the mercenaries. Within moments, they surrounded Gillian. One of them, a man clad in a coat and wielding a spiked ball and chain with a sickle, stepped forward. He warned Ghislain and Gillian that they wouldn't be returning home alive. Then, his gaze fell on Ghislain, who was still calmly sitting atop his white horse. Ghislain looked down at the man and, unfazed, told him to shut up and bring out his captain. The mercenary sneered, laughter rumbling from his chest as he swung his spiked ball and chain in a slow, menacing whirl. "A noble brat has lost his mind," he mocked, his voice dripping with amusement. Then, without hesitation, he aimed the deadly weapon at Ghislain. Before it could strike, something hit the chain with a sharp metallic clang, halting its momentum. The mercenaries barely had time to react before the spiked ball crashed to the ground. Gillian stood firm, his dagger embedded in the chain, stopping the attack in an instant. The mercenaries stared in shock. Ghislain didn't flinch. His voice was calm, commanding. "Gillian, beat them. Just don't kill them." Gillian yanked the chain, sending the mercenary wielding it airborne like a caught fish. Without pause, he swung the ball and chain around his own neck, building momentum before launching it straight into the man's torso. The mercenary hit the ground with a dull thud, groaning in agony. An armored mercenary charged at Gillian. But he barely got 2 steps before Gillian ripped the first man off the ground like a rag doll and hurled him straight into the incoming soldier. The impact sent both crashing to the dirt. Then Gillian turned his gaze on the remaining mercenaries. His death stare locked onto them, and suddenly, the fight drained from their bodies. Their hands trembled. Their feet stayed rooted to the ground. Predator. Prey. Ghislain dismounted his horse, his movements deliberate. His piercing gaze swept over the stunned mercenaries. "How long do you plan to keep me waiting?" Then, as if on cue, the mercenaries scrambled into formation. The crowd parted as Kair, captain of the Cerberus mercenaries, strode onto the scene. Ghislain met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here to make a request." Kair arched a brow, then gestured toward his tent. Without another word, they moved inside. Once seated, Ghislain got straight to the point. "I want to pioneer the forest of beasts." The room stiffened. A murmur spread among the mercenaries, whispers of monsters and death. The forest of beasts. A cursed land crawling with creatures beyond human comprehension. And worse, it bordered Perdium territory. Kair leaned back, arms crossed. His voice was laced with skepticism. Why would anyone stir up that nightmare? Gislin didn't hesitate. Because I am Gislin Perdium, young lord of Perdium. Silence. Then laughter. Kair and his men roared with amusement, slapping their knees, shaking their heads. Everyone laughed, except for Gislin and Gillian. Kair smirked, resting his elbow on the armrest. A rookie like you has no idea what that forest is really like. His gaze sharpened. Go home, brat. You don't belong here. He flicked his fingers, signaling one of his men. Escort him out. Gislin didn't move. Instead, his next words cut through the laughter like a blade. Are you scared? The room stilled. Gislin's voice remained calm, but the insult was clear. Or maybe this so-called skilled mercenary group is just a hoax? Kair's smirk twitched, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he propped his foot up on the table. No point in taking a job if it doesn't pay well. Gislin sneered. Excuses. His tone was sharp. The weak always come up with them. A flicker of irritation crossed Kair's face, but it quickly faded. He exhaled through his nose, waving a hand dismissively. Fine. If you're so determined, just pay up for wasting my time and leave. Gislin smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. I challenge you to a Moriana's recognition. The air cracked with tension. Conversations halted. The room felt smaller. Even Gillian's eyes widened. Kair's expression finally shifted into something serious. He studied Gislin carefully. Do you even know what you're asking for? Gislin didn't waver. Of course. Moriana's recognition. A mercenary tradition as old as war itself. 2 fighters. 1 dagger each. No mana. No enhancements. One of their arms tied together. A fight to the death within a tiny, enclosed circle. No escape. No room to retreat. Most of the time, even the winner barely survived. Gillian stared at Gislin, his thoughts racing. How the hell does young master know about something so brutal? In the mercenary world, refusing a challenge meant one thing: admitting you were weaker. It was an unspoken law, and it could never be ignored. Kair let out a slow chuckle, his sharp gaze locking onto Gislin. Fine. Outside, the crowd erupted. Gislin and Kair stood inside the circle, their wrists bound together as the mercenaries roared for their captain. Kair leaned in, voice low. No turning back now. His breath was warm against Gislin's ear. I've done this 5 times. Confidence dripped from his words. He smirked. And I've won every single one. Gislin didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled Kair closer, his voice barely above a whisper. 5 times. He tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a smirk. I've done this over 100. Kair's eyes widened. And for the first time that day, he felt something cold coil around his spine. Doubt. The fight erupted in a flurry of swift, calculated movements. Both fighters lunged, daggers flashing under the dim light, but neither landed a hit. Blades slashed through the air, narrowly missing their targets as they twisted and dodged with razor-sharp reflexes. The deadly dance continued, stabs, slashes, blocks, and counters, each exchanged with precision. Both warriors were skilled, their experience with the dagger evident. Kair, seeing an opening, lashed out with a kick. Gislin reacted instantly, raising his shin to block. Pain shot through his leg like a crack of lightning. He gritted his teeth, suppressing a wince. That was a mistake. Kair's eyes flickered with something close to surprise. He hadn't expected Gislin to last this long. The crowd roared, rallying behind their captain. Jeers and laughter echoed through the camp as mercenaries mocked the noble for daring to challenge their leader. But the moment Gillian turned his piercing gaze on them, a heavy silence fell over the onlookers. A chill ran down their spines. Gillian's attention snapped back to the fight, his brow furrowing. This isn't good. The circle was barely big enough for one person to lie down, and the fight's brutal rules forbade the use of mana or external force. Only raw physical prowess mattered here. Worse still, the fighters' hands were tied together, limiting movement. Gislin was struggling. He dodged and blocked, but barely. Kair controlled the fight, exploiting every weakness. The size difference was too great. The lack of space too restricting. Gillian's fingers twitched toward his axe. He was ready. If this turned deadly, he'd intervene. Kair thrust his dagger forward, aiming straight for Gislin's gut. At the last second, Gislin leaped, landing behind him. The moment his feet touched the ground, pain flared through his left leg, the same one that had absorbed Kair's earlier kick. He staggered. The damage was piling up without mana to shield him. Kair's smirk widened. He saw the weakness. He pressed forward, relentless. He slashed, targeting Gislin's injured leg again and again. Each strike was precise, merciless. Bruises darkened the noble's skin. Swelling set in. Every movement was costing him. Gislin realized it too. He's trying to break me down, piece by piece. Kair chuckled, watching his opponent struggle. The fight was all but over. He reversed his grip, preparing for a finishing blow. With a powerful swing, he slashed at Gislin. Gislin ducked barely. The blade whistled past his head. Kair transitioned instantly, stabbing downward, but Gislin blocked with his arm. The impact sent shockwaves of pain through his body. Kair wasn't done. He yanked Gislin's right hand forward and drove his knee toward his face. Gislin reacted on instinct. He lifted his left leg, his injured one, to block. The second impact was like fire searing through his bones. He nearly collapsed. Kair grinned. He was ready to end this. He raised his dagger for a final downward stab. Gillian's grip tightened on his axe. Then Gislin smirked. Before the blade could land, he twisted his body, shifting his weight in an impossible maneuver. He spun behind Kair, dodging in the most awkward, unpredictable stance imaginable. And in the same motion he struck, his dagger slicing a clean line across Kair's side. The crowd gasped. Kair's eyes widened in disbelief. Kair lashed out with a wild backstab, but Gislin twisted his body, evading the strike. His dagger flashed upward, this time cutting across Kair's chest. The mercenaries stared, dumbfounded. How is he doing this? Gillian's jaw clenched. He had underestimated the young lord. The crowd's cheers turned to stunned silence. Their captain wounded? Kair, enraged, lunged for Gislin's head. Gislin ducked. He countered with a shoulder check, forcing Kair back, then unleashed a flurry of punches to his face. His movements were fluid, relentless. Kair barely had time to react before Gislin reversed his grip and drove his dagger straight into his arm. Kair sucked in a sharp breath, his face contorted in pain. Blood dripped from the wound, but he refused to stop. He attacked again, this time in a desperate frenzy, stabbing, slashing, aiming for Gislin's head. But Gislin was untouchable. He bobbed and weaved through the assault like a seasoned boxer. Gislin, unbothered, dodged every strike with unnerving ease. Gillian's eyes narrowed. He understood now. Gislin is using Kair's strength against him. He's redirecting momentum, conserving energy. It's like Aikido. With a quiet nod, he released his axe. Gislin didn't need saving. The mercenaries, once rowdy, now booed their own captain. Kair stood, battered, his face swollen, fresh cuts and bruises covering his body. He forced a grin, trying to play it cool despite his evident struggle. But Gislin wasn't impressed. He respected Kair's resolve. Most fighters would have broken the rules by now, resorting to mana when cornered. Yet Kair held firm, taking his loss with gritted teeth. Still, he had one last trick. With a sudden burst of strength, Kair grabbed Gislin and threw him toward the edge of the circle. If Gislin landed outside, he would lose. The crowd held their breath. At the last possible moment, Gislin twisted mid-air, catching himself with his dagger against his own bound wrist. He used the momentum to spin, stepping on Kair's inner thigh to regain balance, just inches from defeat. And then, Gislin grabbed Kair's arm, twisted it, and forced it around his own neck. In one swift motion, he flipped Kair over. The mercenary captain hit the ground outside the circle. Silence. Every pair of eyes locked onto Gislin. He exhaled, looking down at his fallen opponent. His voice was steady. I win. Kair, sprawled awkwardly on the dirt, let out a strained breath. Even now, he managed a pained chuckle. Who the hell are you? Gislin's gaze darkened. He still doesn't understand respect. Without a word, he yanked him up. Kair coughed, wincing. You already won, what do you want? Gislin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled back his fist. Kair's eyes widened. And then, Gislin beat some manners into him. The crowd erupted into chaos, their reactions split. Some cheered for Gislin, reveling in the brutal spectacle, while others watched with growing unease as Kair endured a relentless beating. Kair could take no more. Bloodied and gasping, he shouted for Gislin to stop, desperately reminding him. If one of the participants leaves the circle, he never finished. Gislin's fist crashed into his face, cutting off his words mid-sentence. With cold precision, Gislin mounted Kair, straddling him like a predator pinning its prey. He raised his fist again, his piercing gaze locked onto Kair like a handler disciplining a disobedient dog. Then crack, another devastating blow. Blood splattered across Gislin's knuckles. Kair squeezed his swollen eyes shut, silently praying for the torment to end. But Gislin didn't stop. The punches landed like a relentless drumbeat, pounding his face into the dirt. The once excited crowd fell into an uneasy silence. The cheers died down. Watching their captain get mercilessly dismantled turned their enthusiasm into discomfort. Kair, once the feared mad dog, now lay beneath Gislin, whimpering. His pride shattered. His body broken. He sobbed like a child. Please stop, he finally choked out. Gislin stood up. But Gislin wasn't done. He hauled Kair up effortlessly. His bloodied fist tightened, his expression unreadable. You're not out of the circle yet, he reminded coldly. Kair, his face swollen beyond recognition, his vision reduced to slits, suddenly felt a terror he had never known before. In his panic, he croaked out an order. Kill him. The Cerberus mercenaries reached for their weapons. But they didn't attack, because standing between them and Ghislain was Gillian, his eyes promising carnage. The way he glared at them screamed a silent message. Come closer, and I'll carve you into firewood. The mercenaries froze, rooted in place like deer caught in torchlight. Kayer, looking like a boxer who had gone 12 rounds with Tyson himself, felt his last sliver of hope crumble. He turned back, only to meet Ghislain's piercing stare. It was like a child admiring his favorite toy, but with something far more sinister lurking beneath. Then Kayer saw it, Ghislain's fist. It was at that moment that he knew. Everything went dark. Kayer's thoughts flickered through the past. The nobles he had met before. Corrupt, arrogant, weak. The type he could scare into emptying their pockets. The type he could break. That was why they called him the Mad Dog. And yet, he had been broken by a noble brat. The camp was in chaos. The mercenaries watched in horror as their captain teetered on the edge of death. But they couldn't act. Not with Gillian standing in their way. Ghislain surveyed the trembling crowd, holding up the barely breathing Kayer. This should be enough to tame the wild dogs. His words slithered through the air, heavy with authority. Then, calmly, he ordered the mercenaries. Get first aid. Now! He lifted Kayer slightly, showcasing his pitiful state. If you don't hurry, your captain might not survive. The mercenaries flinched, like children caught watching something they shouldn't. Then they scrambled. Gillian, watching from the side, felt awe creep into his gaze. How had Ghislain, a young lord, made these hardened mercenaries obey him so effortlessly? In the world of mercenaries, where fists spoke louder than laws, Ghislain had just engraved his name into the Cerberus mercenaries. Using the most direct, surefire method, he showed them who the real boss was. Inside Kayer's tent. Silence. Kayer, now bandaged and patched up, sat like a misbehaving child before the principal. Across from him, Ghislain. Sign the contract, Ghislain ordered, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Kayer, his face resembling a badly sculpted clay figurine, clicked his tongue in irritation. But he grabbed the pen and signed. Sliding the contract across the table, he muttered, Here. Ghislain's eyes narrowed. His voice, laced with displeasure, cut through the air like a blade. Here? A chill ran down Kayer's spine. Swallowing his pride, he quickly reworded, I look forward to working with you. Ghislain's gaze lingered. Then, satisfied, he nodded. Good. He reached across the table, grabbing Kayer's hand. Kayer flinched, his body bracing for another beating. Instead, Ghislain smiled. We're family now. Kayer's soul nearly left his body. At this rate, he was going to develop PTSD. A few days later, outskirts of Perdium territory, a group of mercenaries gathered, their expressions bored and hungry. They exchanged idle gossip. Their new employer? Some noble brat. The Perdium young lord. The idea sent ripples of laughter through the group. Easy money, they scoffed. A large, muscular man with a baby-faced scowl stepped forward. His build was monstrous, but his expressions were comically childish. A striking resemblance to Cain, Ghislain's cousin whom he had beaten to a pulp. They called him Gordon the Muscle. Grinning, Gordon puffed out his chest. I'll handle him, he declared, volunteering to pressure the employer. The mercenaries happily threw coins his way, believing his brute strength would intimidate the young noble. Then someone shouted, He's coming. All eyes snapped toward the approaching figure. A solitary rider on a white horse. Behind him, Perdium Castle loomed in the distance. One mercenary snickered. That's gotta be him. Another laughed. Bet he runs the moment he sees Gordon's muscles. Gordon, filled with confidence, turned to his men. Let's give him a proper scare. He grinned. He'd teach this brat a lesson. Then his eyes widened. Behind Ghislain, a group of mercenaries emerged. One of the men froze. His breath hitched. That helmet, he muttered. A helmet shaped like a snarling dog's snout. Recognition dawned. The Cerberus mercenaries. The color drained from Gordon's face. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The group murmured in growing alarm. Why are the Cerberus mercenaries following him? What did that brat do to tame those mad dogs? Then silence. Ghislain rode up, his gaze locking onto Gordon. His expression was sharp, unreadable. Are you the rep? Gordon stammered, his confidence crumbling. Yeah, I'm Gordon the Muscle. A fist slammed into his chest. Gordon choked. Ghislain smirked. Cool name. Gordon almost shat bricks. Fear. Frustration. Confusion. It was all over their faces. Ghislain's commanding voice shattered the tension. Gather the mercenaries. His gaze burned through them. We begin pioneering the forest of beasts. Alright, that's a wrap for today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.